Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to our special webinar entitled Empowering Communities to Prevent Hate Crimes Against Asians. This special program is sponsored by the Korean Consul General in Boston and the Korean Society of Criminology in America, KOSCA. I'm Kyung-Sik Choi, Professor of the Practice and the Director of Cybercrime Investigation and Cybersecurity Graduate Program at Boston University. Today, I have the distinct privilege of moderating this important and timely discussion. Thank you all for taking the time to be here with us as we engage in crucial conversation aimed at combating hate crimes against Asian communities. In recent time, particularly throughout the pandemic, the Asian community has endured alarming increase in hate crimes. It may seem as though the issue of Asian hate crime is diminishing. However, AAPI community leaders and civil rights advocates believe the data does not actually reflect the threats the community constitute face. In response, we have gathered distinguished panel of experts, scholars, and law enforcement officers to delve into the roots of hate crime, explore its historical context, and discuss innovative strategies to effectively counteract these crimes. To kick off our event, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Ben Pak, the president and founder of Korean American Law Enforcement Organization, KALEO, a 501c3 organization committed to fostering leadership through the training, support, and mentorship of the next generation of Korean American law enforcement officers. Mr. Ben Pak has been serving as a LAPD officer since 2008, and he is currently engaged with the Community Relation Office at the Olympic Division of the LAPD. We are incredibly grateful for his presence and insights. Mr. Ben Pak, and the floor is yours.
Professor Choi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are here today to address an issue that was center stage during the pandemic, but since no longer garners the media attention that it used to have. Asian hate crime incidents and hate crimes are nothing new. The issue has been around since the first Asians immigrated to this country, and whether it was the Chinese community in California during the 1800s or the Japanese community during World War II, Asian hate crime has been around our society. Unfortunately, hate crime targets minority groups such as Asian and African Americans, whether it is due to mental health issues or hatred towards a specific group. This is a real problem that we face nowadays. And the issue is compounded by the lack of reporting by the victims, as well as the language barrier and sometimes cultural shame, and or just the thought that no one will do anything about it. Unfortunately, some departments, there's a dismissive attitude and also a lack of understanding by law enforcement officers as to how to go about an Asian hate incident or Asian hate crime. During the pandemic, we saw an increase on Asian hate incident and crimes due to the correlation of the pandemic coming from China. And for whatever reason, a lot of people decided to make Asians the target. Um, since the pandemic, we have seen a decrease, but yet we have seen an increase on what is called microaggressions. They do not escalate to the point that they become an incident or a crime, and yet the Asians continue to be targeted. The old saying goes, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And unfortunately, Asians, we don't squeak as much as other um, communities do. We don't report. We find it shameful sometimes to call the police or reach out for help. Therefore, I think it's important that we continue this conversation and educate our community to do a better job. As you know, Asians were very compliant. We don't like to raise waves. And I think that's a disservice to our community. I myself have been a victim of hate crime, and it's a shame, but I didn't report it myself. And I realized that I teach this, and I myself have to do a better job. And I can only imagine if I myself did not do it, there's got to be countless of others who are victimized and they don't come forward to report. In California, the state has enacted a program called Stop the Hate program, and has dedicated about $15 million over the course of 3 years to empower 80 nonprofit API organizations to reach to our community and do a better job at educating and providing resources to our community members. Now, the question is, why do we have to report it? Because sometimes people feel law enforcement is not going to do anything about it. Well, it is very important to report, because not only creates the data that backs the issue, but also the right people will provide the resources for us to be able to provide the services to the community. Nowadays, the issue may not be as dire. Nevertheless, it is still very important to recognize the urgency and importance of understanding, combating, and ultimately eradicating the hate and violence directed towards the Asian community. Today, we will have an honest discussion, as well as explore potential solutions, as the role of each one of us can play in fostering a more inclusive and understanding society. Without further ado, let's start this important discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pak, for opening remarks. He will engage in all discussion panels throughout the event. I see audience are joining through YouTube channel. We look forward to your participation in this important discussion on preventing hate crime against Asian community. Please use YouTube live chat to ask your question, and we will get back to you, your question during the discussion. Please allow me to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Caroline Petrosino. We call Dr. Petrosino leading voice on hate crime and criminal justice. Professor Emerita and founding chair of the Criminal Justice Department at Bridgewater State University, Dr. Petrosino is a pivotal figure in the study of hate crime. In 2002, her influential research brought her to Capitol Hill to discuss the landscape of hate crime research and the U.S. policy. Her esteemed contributions include articles such as Social Cohesion, Collective Efficacy, and Response of Cape Verdean Community to Hate Crime, and books like Understanding Hate Crimes, Act, Motives, Offenders, and Victims and Justice, and Islamophobia and Acts of Violence, the Targeting and Victimization of American Muslims. Currently, Dr. Petrosino is examining the African-American community perception of hate crime threats and its impact on their societal views and safety. Join us in engaging with this dynamic scholar on pressing issue. Dr. Petrosino, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and good evening. I want to begin by thanking my dear colleague, Dr. Choi, for his gracious welcome and the invitation to this forum. It is deeply appreciated, and I wish to commend the Korean Consulate in Boston, the Korean Society of Criminology, and Boston University for their leadership in supporting and bringing this important forum to fruition. It is indeed my honor to participate in this space, and I look forward to the presentations of distinguished scholars, Dr. Lee, Dr. Choi, and Mr. Ben Pak. Next slide, please. I must begin by acknowledging the recent horrific murder of Wadea al-Fayoumi, the 6-year-old Palestinian American child stabbed repeatedly in Chicago by a man who hated Muslims. What a shameful act. It is my hope, and I am sure the hope of many others, that more people recognize the true cost of bigotry and hatred. The problem is that because of the pervasiveness of prejudice and the fact that we've all lived with it for so long, perhaps we are becoming desensitized to it. But that reaction must be resisted. Hatred should never become normalized. I was asked to address the problem of anti-Asian hate crime and to reflect on how lessons gleaned from the Black Lives Matter movement and perhaps other social movements might have some utility for impacting this category of hate crime. Before I begin the body of my remarks, I wish to offer a broad context in which to think about the vagaries of hate crime. And that context is that of human struggle. The struggle for human dignity, freedom, and equality has existed for ages and continues for many groups. Hate crime is one reflection of that human struggle. It is a picture of contested space in its most rudimentary form. While we focus this evening primarily on the struggle of Asian Americans and African Americans for equality and the freedom to live peaceably, others may seek to interfere with those objectives. Hate crime is a long-standing problem in the United States. Its historical roots go back to the very founding of this country. You might agree with that statement if you recognize the theft of land from indigenous people and the total exploitation of enslaved Africans as evil acts in and of themselves, both being justified by bigoted ideas. My remarks address the topics noted on the slide that you see before you. I hope to provide a limited but enough information in each of these areas. Much of the scholarship on the formation of race and racism in the United States describes an intentional construction of a white racial framework and racial hierarchy that created and sustained a social structure that advocated the superiority of Caucasians or whiteness, which is a social construction in and of itself, and subsequently the inferiority of all non-whites. The primary non-white group was Africans and their descendants, who anchored the bottom of the racial hierarchy. This social structure created systemic advantages for whites to the detriment of enslaved persons, their descendants, and subsequently to other non-whites. Asian immigrants and Asian American citizens would be absorbed into this racial hierarchy, ensuring an unequal status. The discriminatory treatment of Black and Asian persons is well documented and began in the 17th century for Black people and the 19th century for Asians in this country. The question is, why does bigotry remain so resilient against both groups? The short answer is that bigotry and discrimination continue to be nurtured and are attractively functional. That is, they serve a desired purpose and in many ways benefit some segments of society economically and politically. Let us begin to look at the historical development of anti-Asian bias. Next slide, please. Please note if you can read that, the quotes on this slide. They are examples of hostile sentiments toward Asian immigrants in the 1940s. Although initially viewed as industrious and compliant during the 1860s when Chinese labor was first solicited by the US government, the image of Asians was portrayed differently due to the growing popularity of scientific-based racial classifications and the eugenics movement. Asians did not fare well in those schemes. One of the arguments advanced was the belief that Asians were biologically inferior, prone to illnesses, and thus may be negative contributors to the American gene pool. This subsequently led to the sterilization of many Asian women, particularly in California, during the early 1900s. Many stereotypes applied to Native Americans and Africans were also ascribed to Asians. Following the Transcontinental Railroad's completion, Asian men were unfairly considered a labor threat, which resulted in physical violence from white mobs, the destruction of their living quarters, and even killings. But because they lacked sufficient legal protections, little was done by the justice system in response to their victimization. In fact, laws such as the 1875 Page Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924 were enacted to control and constrain the presence of Asian immigrants in the United States. Such restrictions were derived from the cultural values that shaped the laws and policies of the day, such as the Naturalization Act of 1790, which limited US citizenship to white immigrants from Western Europe. In the 1920s, Takayo Ozawa, a Japanese immigrant, appealed the rejection of his citizenship application and challenged the Naturalization Act, arguing that his skin was physically white and that race should not matter for citizenship. But the US Supreme Court ruled against Ozawa, stating that people considered to be white should be confined to persons of the Caucasian race. Race remained a determinant factor in US policies and prescribed boundaries for many. Of course, the infamous internment of thousands of people of Japanese descent during World War II caused the mass arrest and incarceration of more than 100,000 persons, of which some were American citizens. This action occurred because of the long-standing suspicions and prejudice toward Asians. Evidence of this is demonstrated in a statement attributed to Commanding General John DeWitt, who led the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans. Quote, "The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second and third generation Japanese born on US soil, possessed of US citizenship, have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted," unquote. Race determined how Asians were perceived. With these few examples from the past, we see the structuring of Asian stereotypes, which included racial or biological inferiority, untrustworthiness in character, and the Asian as the perpetual foreigner. Each of these views were carefully crafted historically. Now let's turn to anti-Black bias. Again, please, the next slide, please. Please note the quote on this slide, which reflects the attitude of Abraham Lincoln toward enslaved Blacks. From the very beginning, Africans who were kidnapped from their homelands and made to endure the horrors of the Middle Passage on slave ships lived a life in bondage, both physically and mentally, and were continuously subjected to terror and degradation for over 200 years. To be considered chattel slavery meant to be considered property, not a human being entitled to basic civilities or treatment with dignity. It was only reserved for Black people that slavery would be an inheritable condition, meaning the children born of an enslaved mother would be born enslaved. At some point, most slave states passed anti-literacy laws, which criminalized teaching enslaved people how to read. The effort to keep Black people vulnerable and helpless was astounding. During the Jim Crow era, which followed emancipation, Black people were subjected to the irrational violence of lynching, often at the hands of the first hate group in the United States, the Ku Klux Klan. Lynching became a trademark of Black life in the South, averaging over 150 such murders a year. In addition to being subjected to the constant threat of racial violence, Black people were typecast as ignorant, lazy, lascivious, and criminal. Despite slow progress, the devaluation of Black life continued and manifested across several social domains. A particularly egregious was law enforcement and the court system, which looked for any opportunity to jail primarily Black men and force them into another form of bondage through the convict leasing system, which took place after the Civil War in 1865 until it was abolished by President Roosevelt in 1941. Today, we see efforts to control African Americans in many ways. For example, driving while Black, bird watching while Black, handing a police officer a gun license while Black, holding a cell phone while Black, sleeping on your college dormitory sofa while Black, knocking on the door of a wrong address while Black, jogging while Black, grilling burgers in a public park while Black. Even a child selling lemonade while Black raises the alarm among white bigots who thought it was their job to police or contain African Americans. These experiences are both overwhelming and exhausting to the Black community. And these incidents exemplify the persistent discrimination and bigotry aimed at African Americans based on presumptions and stereotypes that were formed during the early history of this country, not unlike that of Asian American stereotypes. We have briefly reviewed the historical evolution of some racial stereotypes for African Americans and Asians. Let us now turn to an example of present day perceptions of Asian Americans. Next slide, please. This slide reports some key findings from the survey of a national sample of over 5,000 US residents conducted February of 2022 by LAUNCH, which is an acronym for Leading Asian Americans to Unite for Change, and TAF, the Asian American Foundation. These are two Asian American advocacy organizations. The general objective of the survey was, of course, to measure perceptions of US citizens toward the Asian Americans. As you read over these selected results, consider whether any resonate with the historical stereotypes formed in the 1800s. We see here the invisibility of Asians despite the crisis of victimization, even with media coverage of these acts. Some respondents found Asians to be the cause of COVID outbreak. And some respondents also questioned Asian Americans' loyalty to America. Even though Asian Americans are a part of the American tapestry, these are somewhat unexpected findings, while at the same time not totally surprising. But what of the image of the model minority? Stereotypes of Asian immigrants and citizens began to include the concept of the model minority in the 1960s. Some argue that this idea served the purpose of dismissing the charge that systemic discrimination and structural racism existed and oppressed racial minorities. Still, even the stereotype of the model minority did not protect Asians from instances of discrimination. The Launch TAF survey reports that some Asian Americans feel unwelcome in the United States, and as much as 71% of Asian American respondents reported that they experienced discrimination. The resilience of bigotry against African and Asian Americans is helped by the continual repetition of negative stereotypes in everyday norms and social institutions such as the family, schools, and media. However, the entertainment industry has recently opened the door wider for more Asian representation in film and television, which is a positive development. We have identified the roots of negative sentiments regarding Asians and African Americans and how some of these perceptions continue to survive today. Let us now review a brief snapshot of the unfortunate bigotry to violence trend against the Asian population that we are currently witnessing. Next slide, please. The three individuals depicted here were all victims of recent hate crimes. Each was very violent. But before we review national hate crime statistics, I want to point out some characteristics of these offenses and their perpetrators. Levin and McDevitt authored a seminal book published in 1993 that summarized what was known about hate crimes and their perpetrators then. First, the majority of hate crimes were not committed by members of hate groups. Most of these incidents happened randomly during routine circumstances and committed by ordinary citizens, not affiliated with a hate group. If the hate crime was assaultive, it was often brutal, resulting in serious bodily injuries. To the perpetrator, targets were interchangeable. In other words, if the perpetrator was looking for a gay person to target, or a Muslim, or a Jew, or an Asian, then any person representing the targeted group would suffice. The National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, also known as START, has provided a more current analysis of hate crime offenders. Their recent publication provides findings from the Bias Incidents and Actors Study, which analyzed information on over 900 adults who had been either arrested or indicted for violent or nonviolent hate crimes. It is the first established database of a national sample of offenders and ranges from 1990 to 2018. I will mention just a few of their interesting findings. Those arrested or indicted for crimes motivated by religious bias tend to be older, have more military experience, have higher rates of mental health concerns, and are more likely to cause mass casualty events. Those motivated by sexual orientation, gender or gender identity bias are often younger, unemployed, and unmarried at the time of arrest. They are also more likely to commit the act with peers while under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Those motivated by race, ethnicity, or nationality bias have higher rates of previous criminal activity. Contrary to Levin and McDevitt's earlier findings, they are most likely to belong to organized hate groups. Now let's take a look at the data. Next slide, please. These data come from the DOJ's annual report on hate crimes. The table contains data from 2016 to 2022. The second column reports the total number of single bias hate crimes. The third column is the total number of racially motivated hate crimes. The last two columns report the raw numbers and percentages of anti-Asian and anti-Black hate crimes. The trend has almost always been as depicted here. African Americans consistently have had large numbers in terms of racially motivated victims. Anti-Asian hate crime has steadily averaged about 5% of all racially motivated hate crimes. However, this trend recently changed. We note considerable increases in anti-Asian motivated hate crimes for the years 20, 21, and 22. I want to add a note about the National Crime Victimization Survey, NCVS. They also collect hate crime reports. NCVS represents results from surveying U.S. households about crime victimization experiences, whereas UCR data is generated by participating police departments. A cursory review of NCVS hate crime data for the years 2010 to 2019 shows a cumulative total of 64,270 Asian bias hate crimes, averaging over 6,000 a year, astronomical number, which possibly signifies a much higher number of occurrences than what is indicated in UCR reports. These surges seem to correlate with media accounts of problematic remarks made by public officials and others during the time of the COVID pandemic. In March 2020, The WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic. The Trump administration subsequently issued a travel ban, and the former president repeatedly referred to COVID-19 as the China virus and made other remarks that may have fueled anti-Asian sentiment. A study published in the Journal of Public Health in May 2021 noted that the surge in attacks on the Asian community corresponded with these inappropriate social media references. Still, it should be recognized that Trump did not create anti-Asian sentiment, but certainly reinvigorated it, giving permission to connect Asian heritage to a frightful and devastating public health emergency. Anti-Asian hostilities were subsequently expressed on people perceived to be Chinese. Whether or not the victim was Chinese did not matter. Asian people were guilty in the eyes of perpetrators and were viewed as the cause of their fears and resentments. This resulted in numerous violent attacks and other ugly forms of racism aimed at the Asian community. As mentioned earlier, the actual number of bias attacks is likely greater than what is shown in the data. In general, hate crimes tend to be underreported. There are vagaries in police training for investigating, capturing, and reporting these data. Some police departments may not have the resources to educate the public on when and how to report these crimes. In addition, there is often a reluctance to report these incidents due to problematic community-police relations. But an important question must be raised here. Why do some members of minority groups commit hate crimes against other minorities? I concur with Levin and McDevitt's view that minorities can be racist and bigoted as well. Anyone can commit a hate crime, even among the racial majority group. History records numerous intra-racial acts perpetrated against Caucasians by Caucasians. Mormons, Catholics, the Irish, and Italians all have histories of mistreatment due to racial, ethnic, and religious bias. In addition to the terrible ongoing strife the world is currently witnessing between Israeli Jews and Muslims in surrounding nations, which is exacerbated by extremists, Armenians are currently being oppressed and brutalized by Turkish soldiers, which reminds us of the 1950 Armenian genocide, which resulted in the deaths of about 1.2 million people due to religious bias. One of the most devastating genocides on the African continent occurred in 1994 Rwanda, where fellow citizens killed an estimated 800,000 Rwandans based on ethnic and class bias. Northern Ireland saw decades of violence between Protestants and Catholics. And it should not be overlooked that there is a history of racial tensions between Japan and South Korea. South Korea itself has grappled with the problem of racism within its borders, according to a report by the National Human Rights Commission of Korea. One of the areas of bigotry that we have not touched upon but is related to the worldview of white supremacy is colorism, which should receive greater attention in examining the impacts of racism and its resiliency. So one can be a racial minority influenced by and acting out harmful acts because of internalized white supremacy attitudes. Developing prejudiced views is seemingly inevitable since these notions are embedded in mainstream culture. Add to that the idea of zero-sum thinking, meaning whatever political or economic gains are perceived gained by one group is interpreted as a loss to a competing group. African Americans may view Hispanic immigrants as a threat to employment opportunities. Asians may see African Americans as criminalistic. Puerto Ricans may view Cubans as arrogant or elitist. And African Americans may view Asians as clannish or even racist. What is ultimately true is that minority on minority victimizations are just as tragic and wasteful and represent that the contagion of bigotry, white supremacy, and colorism has spread among all groups. The racial hierarchy continues to permeate our society and one another. The sooner this dynamic is recognized, the sooner minority groups and others can work together to begin to dismantle bigotry, and racism among minority communities and society writ large. And next slide, please. The slide you are viewing now shows the familiar pyramid of hate, a different version of Gordon Allport's popular 1954 scale of prejudice, which shows a continuum of advancing bigotry. Please keep the pyramid in mind as we review the ideological drivers of hate crime. So I hope I've, at this point, underscored the point that the prejudice encountered by some is a springboard for overt acts such as microaggressions, discrimination, or even hate crimes. And all of that emerges from a well-established worldview deeply entrenched in American culture. What facilitates these views has been the focus of social science research for many decades. The work of scholars like Joe Fegan, Gordon Allport, Ibram X. Kendi, Elijah Anderson, Barbara Perry, Mark Ham, Claire Kim, Derek Bell, and many others help further our understanding of what nurtures bigotry. Of course, the breadth of this scholarship is vast. I will do a cursory review of the dominant themes in the literature, which seeks to explain the belief systems that influence hate crime perpetrators, but primarily those perpetrators who identify with extremist views. Each of these belief systems participates in reaffirming the status of the perpetrator's vision of his or her own community and that of the targeted groups. This continuous effort is what sociologist Barbara Perry refers to as doing whiteness, the acting out of dominance, which sometimes takes the form of violence. Targets are viewed as being out of their place, working where they do not belong, living where they should not, and possessing symbols of wealth that they have not earned and don't deserve. The first belief is Christian identity theology. This is a perverse version of Christianity that claims that the white race represents God's chosen people. Jews are viewed as the source of all evil and seek to destroy the white race financially, culturally, and literally. All non-whites are lesser beings who should be either segregated or eliminated. Xenophobia is also a prominent view and consists of disdain towards immigrants, particularly racial minority immigrants. They are viewed as dangerous, disease-laden, drug and human traffickers, and a threat to efforts to establish a white homeland in America. Immigrants of color are considered not assimilable and will ultimately make America a third world nation. Anti-statism is the idea that the government is the enemy of the white race and seeks to advance the financial interests of a so-called Jewish cabal, an old anti-Semitic view that Jews are secretly plotting to control the United States government and, in fact, the world, in order to subordinate European influence and create a new world order. The 2008 election of the first Black president was a significant sign to extremists that the country was slipping out of white control, thus furthering the idea that the government was anti-white. A common theme that runs through these belief systems is the Great Replacement theory. I'm sure most of you have heard this term through social media. It is a theory that suggests that liberal elites and left-leaning politicians under the influence of Jewish architects are seeking to replace white citizens with non-whites, which will enable them to take control of political and economic institutions and destroy European culture, resulting in white genocide. Remember that Charlottesville saw dozens of neo-Nazis and white nationalists screaming, "Jews will not replace us." This is the fear of being replaced and not in control. RAHOWA is an acronym for racial holy war, and it is one way to stop the Great Replacement from occurring by creating a white homeland in America. This would require several drastic actions, such as closing the borders, creating racially segregated geographical areas in the United States, or ordering deportations along with other potential acts. For some, these plans are ineffective and instead require the prosecution of an all-out civil war, a race war. Some justify this planned violence by stating it is God's will and that since Jews, Black people, and quote-unquote mud people, which are all other non-whites, are soulless and at best are subhuman, killing them would not be immoral. It is alarming to learn of the existence of these belief systems, but they are truisms for some. Recall that FBI Director Christopher Wray testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee in March 2021 that the threat of growing violence from white supremacists, militias, and other extremists is a serious one and an urgent priority for the FBI on the same level as international terrorists, especially after the January 6th insurrection. So the scope of the problem, next slide, please. So the scope of the problem of hate crimes in general and anti-Asian hate crimes in particular is significant but not insurmountable. Many community groups and social movements offer beneficial lessons and methods that may be impactful if utilized. The Black Lives Matter social movement is an offspring of the civil rights movement. It is still in its infancy, in my opinion, only 10 years old since its founding. And as I review their websites, it appears that they are still working to fine-tune their identity and take control of the narrative describing their movement. Still, there are a few things that are perhaps worthy of replicating. First, its messaging. The movement's name explains its existence, what it hopes to achieve. Hearing the phrase Black Lives Matter strongly signals what they are about. Second, their publicized activities seem to be in alignment with their primary goal. BLM engages in many activities in its 40 chapters. Much energy surrounds supporting demonstrations and protests of incidents and practices that they deem to be harmful to the Black community. It also attracts diverse members and followers, young people from across ethnic, racial, and political lines, and they have also gained global supporters. The civil rights movement, in contrast to BLM, the civil rights movement has a long and revered history spanning decades. It is distinguished by its outstanding leaders, organizational skills, ability to appeal to participants from all backgrounds, and merge grassroots efforts with political allies. Because of the efforts of the civil rights movement, significant laws were passed, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is arguably the most important precursor to modern hate crime laws, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. All of them criminalized discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. So the civil rights movement has elements that could be helpful to other racial justice groups seeking to facilitate change in anti-Asian hate crime and other victimization. So this brings us to, I'm about to conclude. What can we do as individuals to help change the social status that we currently live in? These are concerning times. Much drives the social temperature, such as local, national, and global news events. Little Wadia's death is evidence of that. The instantaneous nature of social media and 24-hour cable news only intensifies this reality. We can conduct research and examine data and policies, which certainly have their place. But each of those things cannot explain why we function as we do subconsciously. Until we understand and admit that fear drives us, that we live in social silos because of our fear, and that we have unconsciously invested in a cultural practice and worldview that causes us to look upon each other with suspicion and perhaps disdain. Things may not change as quickly as we like. Let us consider the immigration projections. Next slide, please. The bar chart on this slide displays the immigrant population in the United States between 1960 and 2022 by region of birth. You may note the significant shift away from Europeans to predominantly Latin American, Asian, and African immigrants. The census also projects that for the first time, whites will make up less than 50% of the population by 2045. We will all find ourselves living in a country that will be more diverse than it has ever been. How will we respond to that? We can perhaps start with introspection and self-reflection. For example, when considering your social network, ask yourself if it contains only people who look like you. If it does, maybe it's time to broaden it and get to know people from diverse backgrounds. And if you realize that you harbor prejudiced attitudes, determine to do something to shrink that lens. Remember that the second level on the prejudice pyramid is avoidance, the subconscious or conscious tendency to avoid people who are different from you. Challenging that habit may be one way to begin to heal ourselves from fearing one another. The autobiographies of those who have come out of hate groups and the hate movement have testified that encounters with the very people they were taught to hate began their healing process. If former extremists can rid themselves of this mindset, surely there is hope for the rest of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Petrosino, for your comprehensive insights on hate crimes from socio-political angles. So I think we have Ben, Mr. Ben Pak, and also Dr. Petrosino here. I have a lot of questions, to be honest, and it's fascinating listening kind of the history. My first question, kind of simple, because we have a limited time. I know I want to make it short. So Black Lives Matter movement, right? And so I didn't know that much kind of structure inside and elements in there. And so I know American, Asian American kind of, the groups, and we kind of working on something similar to Black Lives Movement. But how do we start? And, I'm not huge kind of, the expert in that area. So I don't know. And what based on all the legal efforts and the lots of things, history kind of telling us. And so what lessons and can he kind of draw, kind of might address kind of issue of anti-Asian hate crime? What can he use that component to, like, essential components we start off? And that's my first question. Then another question, maybe this question can be kind of sensitive. African American, you mentioned about that, like, so community has had a historical kind of tension with white community, but recently we have also observed kind of incidents of hate crime against Asian involving African Americans. So what underlying factors might be contributing to this, and how can he foster understanding and reduce kind of tension between these two communities? So Ben Pak and Mr. Ben Pak, and you can definitely kind of contribute this question. And so, yeah, please, I want to learn. Thank you.
I believe the first question is for Dr. Petrosino, correct?
Yep. Yes.
I just want to say about starting something. How do you begin? First of all, I'm very impressed with AAPI. Do I have all the letters? They look like a really strong organization, and they have so many areas that they are making sure they are monitoring. They're making sure that they're training people to know what to do to support victims. From what I see on their websites, they are a very good organization. And I think one of the things that is helpful to do is when you find an organization that seems to be making some accomplishments, contact them. Most of these organizations want to share how they got to be as successful as they are. I know years ago, I contacted Not in Our Town. Not in Our Town is a wonderful organization. They have chapters throughout this country, and they are very, very generous with telling people in different communities, if they're interested in starting a chapter there, they actually give them a blueprint and how to begin to form an organization right there in your own community that helps to take a stand. So, the first thing that happens when a hate crime happens in a community, you have to support that victim, and they tell you how to do that. And I mean, hate crimes have to be denounced. but the more voices that denounce, the better. And so that's why it's good to work within an organization or a group that share similar values and feel just as dedicated to that cause.
Thank you. Ben, can you start answering the second question?
Well, in California, especially in LA, we have seen that a lot of the perpetrators of these type of incidents are African American. And I think an honest dialogue has to be open. I think we have to be able to talk it out loud without the fear or repercussion of sounding racist or sounding that we're targeting a specific group. I mean, we are a minority, and definitely African American community is a minority too. But when the continuous reporting happens to be of African American descent, we do have to look at the genesis of why is this happening. First, let's look at the victims. I think the majority of victims are either frail or elderly people, and most of the times they become easy targets. When somebody is 6'4" and looks like a very well, somebody who's burly, they're not going to come and attack that person. But when somebody is 5 feet tall and 100 pounds, becomes easy target. That's one. Number two, a lot of this happens to be homeless people with mental health issues. So I think we need to address some of that as well. But I've been asked this question many times, and it is a complex answer because it's not a one-dimensional, it's very multidimensional. So I think the government, as well as the police department and each of our community, has to come with an open mind and have a discussion, because the reality of it is that the two ethnic groups are joined very well, and it is intertwined. And I believe that it is due to the drug use, it is due to the resounding homelessness issue that happens. And I believe even among homelessness, there is a big majority or a big disproportional number of African American people who are homeless. And I think that needs to be addressed. What is the answer, or what is the solution? I still look for it, and I definitely welcome the idea of having an open dialogue. But in my opinion, I think everybody is afraid to actually talk about it because they do not want to sound that they are exclusionary, or so yeah. I don't know if I answer, but I just feel that we need to have an open dialogue.
Dr. Petrosino, yeah, let's talk about this, and it's important.
Well, I think what is important is that we begin to communicate with one another before there is even a crisis. Like this whole idea of building bridges and coming together as a community has to start at some point. It doesn't have to start when someone gets beat up. I mean, there are so many things that parents who are African American, parents who are Asian have in common. Caring about your children's safety, caring about the price of groceries in your neighborhood. There's so much to come together and talk about that we share together. I think being able to build communications before there is a terrible incident is what's important. That's what builds and strengthens and creates coalitions. And I think we have to learn to do that instead of waiting until these tragedies happen. And then we're struggling to see who's going to stand with us. Well, we have to start standing together across a number of different issues, not just when these ugly events happen. I think that would help a great deal. I know one of the things that, and I don't want to go on talking, but one of the things I learned from looking at that Cape Verdean situation, the Cape Verdeans, when they were, a couple of their members were murdered by a neo-Nazi. Well, who came in? There was a huge group of Catholics from the next town came in to stand with the Cape Verdean community. Now that's nice, but it would be even, I think, more impactful if they had a relationship with the Cape Verdean community before these murders had happened. Now, so we have so many things that we can come together about. And I suggest that we start having those discussions about things what we have in common before these tragedies occur. Then it's easier to come together and stand together and say, listen, we're in this fight together. It's the same fight.
That is true. So I've seen that an API kind of working with Black Lives Matter movement group together. So I think that that's a kind of great start. And I think, the connecting dot, right? And so commonality we are seeking, and as a minority, I think that Dr. Petrosino, you pinpoint very important thing. So we cannot really, we don't have to start kind of really big, and maybe small thing from the community side, helping each other. Even as you mentioned, kids kind of binding together, and as parents together. So starting something small, I think that sounds like essence. So anything to add? Like, I know the legal pieces has been kind of developed. I just learned a lot from you. So it's a legal structure and progress, and how do we do better? And in other words, is Black Lives Matter really successful, in your opinion? And then how we kind of move forward, and then so that like we can, as a Asian community, we can follow that path.
Well, let me just say this. I think it's really important. You talk about building and strengthening relationships. There's one thing that has to be become more successful, and that's building relationships, the police and community relationships. And that's a really, really huge hurdle for some community groups. Right now, as I mentioned in my comments, Black Lives Matter they're not so much focused on hate crimes per se, because they're very focused on police violence. And so that is a critical relationship. Communities must trust police. Police must see citizens as their partners. And we have to go back to the drawing board to figure out how to build trust between citizens in the community and the law enforcement, because they are dependent on one another, and they shouldn't view each other as enemies, but they do in some instances. So there's a lot of work to be done. We have to strengthen ties in the community and community with police.
Ben, how can you work together? Police
I agree with Dr. Petrosino, but at the same time, I think sometimes we are our own worst enemies. As you know, a lot of us became police officers after the 1992 LA riots, due to the fact that we felt that we had no representation in the police department. So my brother, or one of my best friends, we all gravitated towards the police department, and I saw a lot of people go towards that direction. One of the saddest thing that I see nowadays, especially in California, is that the African American community is moving away from the police department. The recruitment is so down, at least in California. And when I talk to other people throughout the country, they tell me the same thing. This is going to be very damaging to the African American community in the generations to come. And I just don't understand that at this junction, if any community feels that it needs to be empowered, instead of being supportive, where you have to be more reachable, they're actually driving themselves away from it. It's kind of weird that when I approach some, I'll give you an example. I was trying to have a conversation with a group of massage parlor workers. And then I was willing to meet with them to give them some advice, as well as kind of have an open dialogue. But that invitation was rejected. And I just couldn't understand why they'll reject a genuine effort And I said, I'm not going to come in uniform. I'm not going to be a police officer, but as an off-duty officer, I can meet with you to kind of have this dialogue. And it was not welcome. And so I see that those type of incidents have to be received better in order for us to be able to kind of learn from each other. And I think this goes with the Korean and African American community. We've been working together, and yet we don't have the trust yet with each other. So how we find that happy medium, or where we can have is something that I think we need to continue to work. And I think churches have been a good place to start, but each community has to be strong enough to admit your own faults and where you need to be able to work in order for the other community to start trusting our own community.
And the time, we are top of the hour, so we need to move on. But at least we kind of talk about this sensitive topic, and then next segments, right? And provide some more detail at the end. Hopefully, we have a solid answer, and that's the whole purpose of this webinar. So thank you, Dr. Petrusino and Mr. Benpak, for your in-depth discussion. Now let's transition to our next segment, and which will delve deeper into hate crime research, specifically focused on Korean community. Our next speaker is Dr. Shin-Young Choi, assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Kennesaw State University. Beyond academia, Dr. Choi is actively engaged in groups such as Georgia Advocates for Crime Prevention and Korean Society of Criminology in America, and are all working towards addressing anti-Asian hate crimes. Dr. Shin-Young Choi, we eagerly await your insights. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining my presentation. My name is Shin-Young Choi. I am an assistant professor of the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. This presentation is based on research that I did with my colleagues, Dr. Ji-Sun Son and Dr. Gang Lee and Dr. In-Sun Park. And this research was supported by the Korea Foundation, the Korean Society of Criminology in America, and the Georgia Advocates for Crime Prevention. The title of the presentation is After Atlanta Spa Shooting, Perceived Police Legitimacy in the Korean American Community. Next slide, please. In March 2021, a mass shooting spree occurred at 3 different spots in the metropolitan area of Atlanta, Georgia. A suspect is 21 years old white man whose name is Robert Long. He shot and killed 8 people. 6 of the victims were Asian women, and half of them are Korean American, who are Sunja Kim, Young-hae Ye, Sunjung Park, and Hyunjung Kim. They all were aged between 50 and 70, and who were either someone's beloved mother, wife, or grandmother. The suspect was charged with numerous crimes and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This tragedy renewed calls for action against anti-Asian violence in the US amid a spike in anti-Asian hate crimes caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. President Biden also condemned this shooting as anti-Asian hate crime. Next slide, please. However, a Georgia sheriff's captain characterized this mass shooting as having a really bad day when speaking at a news conference. According to his statement, the suspect has a sex addiction and targeted the spouse to remove the sexual temptation that Asian spouse presented. And the captain seemingly sympathized with the suspect by saying that he just had a really bad day and was fed up on the days of the incident, which led to killing of 8 people. This remark suggests that the shooter's actions were excusable, and it downplays the severity and premeditation of the attacks. This remark was widely condemned, and the captain later apologized, saying he didn't mean to sympathize with the suspect. Next slide, please. While 6 of the 8 people killed were women of Asian descent, the police denied that the killings had been racially motivated, which means that he was not racist, not misogynist, and not xenophobic. This was questioned by numerous organizations, including Asian communities. Asian community pointed out that the sheriff's office failed to acknowledge the hate and racism that may have played a role in the attack. This utterly absurd response appears to show ignorance of sexualized racism of Asian women throughout the US history. In other words, this response shows how failing to understand America's racist past against Asian women can lead to completely misinterpreting the root of these tragedies born from racial hatred. The police officer's response to the shooting shows how racist biases and misconceptions can shape their response to crime, especially when victims belong to a minority group. Therefore, the police investigation would be seen as unfair and lacking integrity among marginalized communities. This would lead to a lack of trust and confidence in law enforcement. Next slide, please. There was mixed feelings about the perceived legitimacy of the police. Some Korean Americans appreciated the efforts of the police in investigating and apprehending the suspect, while others expressed concerns about the history of racial profiling and discrimination against Asian Americans by law enforcement. Therefore, this study attempted to investigate the association between Korean American residents' perception of police legitimacy and their level of cooperation with police within the Korean community in the Atlanta area. Next slide, please. Police legitimacy. The definition of police legitimacy refers to the perceived authority, trustworthiness, and fairness of a police force in the eyes of the public. So, building trust and legitimacy is the foundational principle of relations between police agencies and the communities. Therefore, it plays a crucial role in maintaining social order and cooperation between the police and the community. It should be noted that police legitimacy can vary across different cultures and societies. Cultural norms and values shape people's expectations of how the police should behave. For example, in many predominantly white communities, there is a general belief in the effectiveness of the criminal justice system, which can lead to an expectation that the police will act fairly in their interactions with the public. However, in many black communities, due to the history of racial mistreatment, there is a skepticism about the police and a belief that the police may not act in the best interests of Black individuals. Asian Americans have distinct experiences, concerns, and expectations of the police as newly immigrated minorities when it comes to interaction with the police. Next slide, please. This trust varies depending on factors such as the individual's experiences with law enforcement, individuals' level of language proficiency, and their socioeconomic status. Many studies reported that victims of crime tend to hold less favorable attitudes toward the police, which leads to lower rates of cooperation and crime reporting. On the other hand, non-victims of crime generally hold more favorable views of police legitimacy, which may contribute to a greater willingness to cooperate with the police. Ethnic minorities like Asians often face higher victimization rates compared to white residents. In the context of Asian communities during the COVID-19 pandemic era, being a victim of crime plays a significant role in shaping their willingness to cooperate with the police and to report crimes to them. In addition, English proficiency can play an important role in the relationship between non-native English speakers and the police. Limited English proficiency can hinder effective communication with police officers. This can lead to misunderstandings, miscommunications, and difficulties in accessing essential services or understanding one's rights. English proficiency may affect one's willingness to report general crime victimization and hate crimes to the police. It was reported that a significant number of hate crimes go unreported to the police. However, previous studies show that language proficiency did not always determine perception of the police. Social demographic factors such as gender, age, education, and income have often been examined as predictors of perception of police among racial minorities and immigrants. But the relationship seems to be complex and be affected by contextual factors specific to each population and settings. Next slide, please. This is the model that we analyzed in this study. In this model, we investigated factors that have a significant relationship with individuals' level of cooperation with the police. We explored whether Korean residents' perceptions of police legitimacy, victimization experiences, English speaking skills, and demographic factors predict their levels of cooperation with the police. Next slide, please. We collected data from September to October last year at the Korean American communities in the Atlanta area. And we specifically targeted Koreans over the age of 18, regardless of their immigration status. And survey was done both in person and online. Next slide, please. As a result, 183 Korean Americans participated the survey, but we used 128 cases for the analysis. So about 51% of the responders were male, and 54% were aged over 60. 58% had some college or higher education background, and 37% reported that their annual household incomes were between $60,000 and $99,000. And about 41% experienced victimization of crime, and 31% experienced victimization of hate crime. Next slide, please. This table shows the social demographic information of the respondents. When you see the language, less than half of the participants reported that their English proficiency was higher than a basic level. So more than half used English at the basic level or barely understood English. Next slide, please. This table shows the other social demographic information of the respondents. As you see here, about 30% of the Korean respondents has been a victim of anti-Asian hate crime. Next slide, please. We used survey questions developed by Tankebe and his colleagues, who also surveyed Americans to examine police legitimacy. Tankebe he used 4 dimensions and 16 indicators to measure police legitimacy, which are lawfulness, procedural fairness, distributive fairness, and police effectiveness. This table compares the average scores of each question between Korean participants and the US participants. As you see, of the 75% of police legitimacy indicators, the US participants show significantly higher average scores than Korean participants. So US respondents generally showed higher level of police legitimacy than Korean respondents. For Korean respondents, their average scores of 6 indicators of police legitimacy are lower than the median value, which is 2.5. This means that they mistrusted some aspects of the police legitimacy. For example, Korean respondents generally did not agree with that the police treat everyone with dignity, the police provide the same quality of services to all citizens, and crime level in their neighborhood have changed for the better in the last year. They did not agree with those indicators. Next slide, please. This table shows the average scores of survey items that measure whether they are likely to report to police when they are involved in a series of crimes, including hate crime. Given that median value is 2.5, we can tell the Korean respondents would be willing to report various crimes to police, including hate crime. Next slide, please. This table shows the result of our regression analysis on police legitimacy and cooperation with police. In brief, we found that Korean Americans who were older were more likely to see the police as legitimate authority, and Korean Americans who were male, who was a victim of crime, and who had a higher level of police legitimacy and English proficiency, higher level of English proficiency, were more likely to report crime to police. So in other words, if someone who did not see police as a legitimate authority, who was female, who was not good at speaking English, and who had never been a victim of crime, was less likely to report crime to police. Next slide, please. When we specifically focus on cooperation with the police in terms of hate crime, Korean Americans who used better English and had been a victim of crime were more likely to report hate crime as well as anti-Asian hate crime. Also, hate crime victims were more likely to report anti-Asian hate crime to police. Given that respondents are also Asian Korean Americans, they would not be willing to report hate crime to police unless the victims are Asian, unless the victims look like themselves. This is an interesting finding. Next slide, please. So, in conclusion, some Korean American voiced mistrust for the police response alleging racism against Asian Americans, while others showed desire to cooperate with the investigators to apprehend the offenders. Language barriers may have made it challenging to cooperate with the police, since higher English proficiency is related with higher cooperation with the police. We believe that our findings highlight the importance of building trust and effective communication between law enforcement and the community, especially marginalized community, for strengthening community policing initiatives. That's it for my presentation. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching my presentation. Please let us know at the end of the session if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shin-Young Choi, for your insightful presentation. Very interesting finding you have. We look forward to addressing questions in the Q&A following our next speaker. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Henare Lee, serving as an associate professor and the chair of cybercriminology and cybersecurity program at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts. Dr. Lee has been actively engaged in anti-Asian movement activities by presenting numerous webinars and collaborating with scholarly works and conducting interviews in Massachusetts. One of her main research centers on bias crimes against minorities, with special focus on crimes against individual of Asian descent. Dr. Lee, please take the floor.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Choi. As he mentioned, my name is Henry Lee, an associate professor of criminal justice and chair of the cybercriminology and cybersecurity graduate certificate program at Bridgewater State University. Before I start presenting the work for today's meaningful webinar, I would like to thank the Korean Consulate General in Boston for sponsoring, and the Center for CIC and the Criminal Justice Program at Boston University for hosting this important webinar under the name of Empowering Communities to Prevent Hate Crimes Against Asians. As all of you can see, today's presentation is titled Gray Areas Between Racism and Hate Crime Victimization Among Korean Businesses. Even though my name is on the title, this work cannot be done without my colleagues and collaborators, Dr. Kyung-Sik Choi from Boston University, Dr. Claire Lee from University of Massachusetts Lowell, and Dr. In-Sung Park from the University of Akron. This study stemmed from our initial project on hate crime prevalence and prevention technique studies during COVID-19. As Asians, we were worried when we heard about increasing cases of hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders during COVID-19. But we are astonished as scholars even more when we found out that there were limited number of studies on Asian hate and bias crimes. The hate crime literature was closely tied with racism literature, and most of the contents were focused heavily on Black and Hispanic population. Fortunately, since COVID-19, Asian-focused literature has been published, and we hope our work will join that route to fill more gaps in the literature. Now, let me present the purpose of our current study. While conducting the hate crime research on Korean businesses, we realized that many people share similar characteristics as Korean immigrants who are living in the United States. Most of them experienced at least one criminal incident throughout their lives in the United States. It's reacted differently with a different rationale, which yielded varying consequences. Still, the underlying ideas of how the incident happened and how to manage it and what may change such incidents were similarly shared. They want to adapt to a new culture. They want to survive. And for some of them, they want to give better futures for their children. When we found these similarities, we researched further and found following different concepts that may explain how all those other incidents and experiences merged as shared ideas and goals. Modal minority, perpetual foreigners, and challenges of assimilation and cultural precarity, and how such shared ideas and goals may shape people's perspectives toward racism and hate crime. Let me go over each concept briefly with you first. The first concept is the idea of modal minority. The modal minority refers to a minority group defined by factors such as ethnicity, race, or religion, whose members are perceived to be achieving a higher socioeconomic status than the overall population average. After the 1960s, the removal of immigration restrictions led to a significant influx of Asian Americans in the United States. During this particular time, immigrants from East Asian countries strategically emphasized ideals like family, patriotism, and work ethic, showcasing their citizenship while downplaying challenges faced within their ethnic communities. This trend also highlighted the competitive work ethic of Asian Americans, who mirrored their commitments to education from their countries of origin, contributing to academic and professional success in the United States. This phenomenon underpins the model minority stereotypes. As this image by Angelica Ordonez demonstrates, the model minority stereotype categorizing select groups as smart, hardworking, intelligent, and excellent immigrants, such as those from East Asian countries and Indian Americans. The next concept that we applied is the idea of perpetual foreigner. The perpetual foreigner stereotype is a racist and xenophobic form of nativism in which naturalized and even native-born citizens are perceived by some members of society as foreign because they belong to a minority ethnic or racial group. The last but not least concept would be the idea of assimilation and cultural precarity. The classical assimilation theory argues that assimilation by the immigrants are necessary for preserving social cohesion, and thus focuses on a one-sided, monodirectional process of immigrants' incarceration leading to upward social mobility. This idea has been a prominent theory explaining the adaptation of immigration until scholars have criticized the classical assimilation theory for imposing ethnocentric and patronizing demands on minorities struggling to preserve their cultural and ethnic integrity. The idea of assimilation becomes an important element of our study since it carries a critical background that may highlight the idea of cultural precarity. Cultural precarity emphasizes the relevance of belonging while pointing towards the interdependency of immigrants' aspirations, statuses, and recognitions from others. This idea of instability to assimilate to a new culture was identified among our respondents when they expressed the struggle with language and cultural understanding while adapting to life in the United States. To elaborate more regarding our study and findings, let me introduce our methodologies. As part of a more extensive study, we conducted interviews twice with 19 owners and employees of Korean businesses in Massachusetts. The first phase of interviews was completed between August and October 2021, and the second phase was conducted between February and April 2022. We conducted semi-structured interviews using a set of questions covering direct and indirect hate crime victimization, immigration history, and personal background. All interviews were conducted face-to-face in Korean, with each interview lasts approximately 40 to 90 minutes. We asked for the interviewees permission to record the interviews. Some of them agreed to be recorded and others did not. Therefore, each recorded interview was fully transcribed, while unrecorded interviews relied on the interviewer's notes. We anonymatized their identification information to protect respondents' identities and codified our recordings. Several patterns and themes were identified regarding perspectives on racism and anti-hate crimes using 6-phase framework, which consists of familiarizing with the data, generating initial codes, searching, reviewing, defining themes, and writing up the findings. Based on the interviews and thematic analysis, the study found several interesting perspectives. First, overall, most of the respondents initially unable to differentiate hate crime from racism and racism from hate crime. When we first addressed the definition of hate crime using the Department of Justice official definition, a crime motivated by bias against race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, or disability, many respondents initially asked back, saying, "Isn't that racism?" At that point, and throughout the interview process, we were able to conclude that the line between racism and hate crime to our respondents were pretty much not there. Those two words were synonym to them. This phenomenon is nothing new, since the concept of racism are broad and does not necessarily require a punishable act compared to the hate crime. But the fact that we were able to identify such blurred line of perception, it may address more important elements of racism and hate crime, the reporting. Since not all racism-related acts can be punished, people may be hesitant to report the incident unless they are physically harmed. The issue of reporting, however, goes beyond the scope of current study, and we are in the process of writing another piece emphasizing the areas of reporting. So I will not dive deeper in that particular area. Instead, I'm focusing on presence of racism and hate crime among Korean immigrants for today's presentation. When we asked about their lives, respondents' life experiences in the United States regarding different types of discrimination, including crime and racism, participants shared various stories ranging from vandalism to workplace bullying to school bullying and gunshot incidents. Interestingly, however, the personal interpretations and assessments behind its victimization varied. Let me go over one by one and share how each incidents were regarded as racism and hate crime with different rationale. One respondent reported the case of graffiti and vandalism. During the interview, the respondents demonstrated that the incident may happen because the business is located at the place where it used to carry the image of unsafe neighborhood and the presence of drunk people at night. In her narrative, she demonstrated feelings like an immigrant existing without the security of belonging in her neighborhood. As a tenant, she was uncertain about the appropriate course of action and was trying to avoid any potential difficulties or legal issues. At the same time, her way of fitting into her own enclaves shows cultural precarity by primarily considering any potential negative consequences rather than actively engaging in proactive approaches. Workplace bullying is another case. One of the interviewees, who has been living in the United States since 1990s, shared workplace bullying incidents while working as a mailman. When he first arrived in the United States, he experienced language barriers, but needed to provide for his family. Luckily, he got a job at the local post office as a mailman. Just like a traditional Korean father, his focus was to work hard and make earnest money to feed his wife and daughters under any circumstances. Therefore, when his supervisor asked him to clean the bathroom after his shift or put him on extra round of trips, instead of arguing that was not the part of his job, he did what was asked of him, while other colleagues never did the same work. In addition, from time to time, his supervisor would confront him, accusing him of filing a complaint with the union, which he never did. Whenever such incidents happened, instead of properly clarifying the situation, he would simply smile and rush out of the conversation to avoid the uncomfortable situation. While conducting an interview, he did not think what he experienced was racism. Instead, he blamed his lack of English skills and regretted not being proactive in learning and actively engaging in conversations. On the other hand, when asked whether he believes his daughters experienced a similar situation, he quickly denied the possibility. This case coincides with segmented assimilation theory, which asserts different paths of assimilation, including traditional integration with acculturation into the white American middle class, and differentiates the process of assimilation for the first and the second generation immigrant. Furthermore, his narrative emphasizes that the traditional Korean notion of sacrificing for the family, where the success of the children is seen as his own success. Another case would be the school bullying. One of the youngest interviewees shared his story when he first moved to the United States. Like many other non-English speaking immigrant children, he came to the United States without knowing how to speak English. He strongly agreed the bullying he experienced should be regarded as a racism since he was being subjected to bullying due to the language barrier, appearance, and cultural differences. But his assessment of racism was not negative in nature, but more about emphasizing ignorance and the necessity of more diverse cultural education. This case was particularly interesting since it demonstrated the different views on racism, which was rooted in ignorance rather than purely negative intentions, which underscores the complex nature of racism and the discrimination. In addition, this case highlighted the resiliency of individuals facing adversity while adjusting to a new society without knowing the language and culture. The last incident shared by one respondent may be the most serious form of incidents since it involves the theft and the robbery with a gun. When the respondent opened a gas station in a community with a large Black population, he experienced several theft, shoplifting, and at least 2 gun-related robberies. When sharing his story, he expressed anger and blamed the disorganized neighborhood and the people who reside in. He did not say they are all bad, but stated that some of them believe and even told him that we, Asians, stole their workplace and his gas station should be theirs, not his. So they showed no guilt in coming in and stealing his stuff. He fought for it and invited local law enforcement officers and made them visit the store regularly by providing free donuts and coffees. Once their appearance at the store became a norm, incidents were minimized but never stopped. Luckily, once he moved to Massachusetts and changed his business, he no longer experiences violence. But this story raised a crucial issue on why minorities target other minorities. Would this be part of assimilation, or would this be a cultural precarity? The answer may be in between those two, or warrants completely different explanations, such as inferiority complex. The study is not arguing which one is which. What we emphasize from the current study is a presence of such issue and requesting more attention. When we conduct the study, we realize that most respondents faced various types of racism and discrimination. Realizing their status as ethnic groups of perpetual foreigners with limited English ability, they tended to internalize the blame and worked hard to earn social citizenship when faced with hardship. At the same time, when asked for more details regarding their experience, many of them recalled their memories and explained how it could be handled differently if they were experiencing the same situation nowadays. All participants realized that their cultural precarity as Korean immigrant business owners and employees is an obstacle to finding their home in the United States. Therefore, they emphasize the need for public educational resources to further understand American culture, society, and English, thereby making it easier to navigate their lives in the United States. And drawing from different accounts and perceptions from Asian immigrants and business owners in the study, we also propose several policies to build racial and ethnic sensitivities and awareness, such as community events that encompass different ethnic groups, including white individuals, community engagement to cultivate cultural understanding, and mental health services and support for Asian immigrants. And this concludes today's presentation. Thank you for being attentive during my presentation at this late in the United States and early in Korea. If you have any questions or concerns that I did not address during the Q&A session, which will happen shortly, please feel free to contact me via my email, h2lee@bridgew.edu. Once again, thank you for the opportunities to present the work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for sharing your insight. To be honest, I prepared lots of questions. However, we have less than 20 minutes, so I want to throw kind of big question. So in terms of kind of innovative approach, right? Innovation, I think we've been talking, at front when we start this webinar. So what specific community engagement initiatives or policy recommendation would you kind of suggest? Bridging all the gaps, it's typical, all the gaps like we see, and fostering kind of deeper mutual cultural understanding, as you mentioned, kind of thereby mitigating, right, hate crimes and indirect and direct victimization. So reflect your research experience. So what's the simply like? What's the kind of best solution? What can you do with the hate crime, Asian hate crime? So reflect your research and tell us what's the policy could be good, very strong policy, police practice. What should we do?
I can start.
Go ahead.
Based off of our study, we recommend developing and supporting educational programs in schools and communities that promote cultural understanding, tolerance, and respect. These programs can include curricula on diversity, inclusion, and the history and contribution of various cultural groups. In addition, we also recommended organized community dialogues and workshops where individuals from different cultural backgrounds can come together to share their experiences, discuss concerns, and build empathy. It is also important to promote multicultural events and festivals that celebrate the diverse cultures within the community. These events can be an opportunity for cultural exchange, fostering a sense of unity and pride among different communities and mitigating hate crimes and indirect victimization against minority populations. And if you need more specifics, please stay tuned for our publications.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing, and looking forward to seeing kind of new approach. Anyone else? Kind of new approach, innovation, and something we can make a difference here.
I can go. Um, from my perspective, I believe it is hard to find a like one size fits all approach to remedy this kind of issue because we are very diversified society. So there are many diverse groups that have their own interests and concerns. So just one approach cannot satisfy their all their interests and concerns. So we need diverse approaches to remedy this issue. And so we need to encourage diversity in every aspect of the criminal justice system as well as the law enforcement agencies. For example, they can encourage diversity in their agency by recruiting officers from a variety of cultural backgrounds and also who can speak multiple languages. And also, the police may need to provide various language access services, such as various interpreter services, and also translating materials to ensure that not only English speakers, but also non-English speakers can also effectively communicate with the police officers and access important information and essential services. Also, what's important is outreach and also education. So, especially police officers, they can collaborate with the local community organization who represent their own racial groups or own groups of interest to bridge the gap between the police and the Doge community. So normally, these local community organization can act as intermediaries and advocates. For example, in Atlanta area here, we have a local organization called GACP, Georgia Advocate of Crime Prevention. They act as an intermediary between the local law enforcement agency here, as well as Korean American communities and Asian communities as a whole. So, in brief, I believe that we need to diversify our approaches to remedy these hate crime issues together.
Great. And Mr. Bampak, and you've been working with Korean community many years, and so any kind of innovative kind of outreach program, and so you implemented in the LA?
Actually, we have piggybacking on Dr. Choi's comment about law enforcement. Our department, LAPD, is actually going to be launching an online reporting system in January, where you can report Asian hate incidents and hate crime. I believe that's a very innovative approach for law enforcement because the community sometimes don't want to call because they're not sure whether this escalates to the point of something that is reportable. And as I had mentioned previously, there is a sense of shame sometimes with Asians that you are reporting something like this. Therefore, I believe the department is going to try this online approach to see how it is helpful. Furthermore, the state of California has empowered a lot of the minority groups, especially Thai, Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, for us to be able to use the grant to approach smaller segments of the community, individuals. Because once again, Asians don't do well when you're in a large platform. One of the things that I've noticed whenever we do any presentations, if there is more than 40, 50 people in a room and you ask any questions, nobody answers, nobody raises their hand. But as soon as you're done, all 40 of them approaches you and then they have a question. And I see Dr. Choi and Dr. Lee laughing because they know what I'm talking about. And in order for us to be able to approach them, we're doing smaller approaches and smaller presentation. And I think having more of these type of webinars and seminars, uploading it in YouTube, is very helpful, because one of the unfortunate things about Asian hate crime or any type of crime is does not become relevant until it happens to you. And unfortunately, that's the reality of it. And until we make people aware that this is something that all of us has to be involved, and yes, Asian hate crime affects us, but I have done presentation with the Latino community. I've done presentation with the African American community. I've done presentation with the Jewish community, and it affects them exactly the same way. And the same issues that we have, it affects them equally. So I think more dialogue, more presentation, to the point that more people are aware of what's going on.
Thank you. Dr. Petrosino? You are muted.
Oh, I think the ideas are very good, and this is the thing that I think about as I listen, is that coalition building is so essential, that when you have programs that seem to be effective for a given community or given people, that needs to be expanded, and expanded through the means of building coalitions with other groups. Because I think what we see, and what's frustrating from my point of view, is that we have reports of this program being effective and that program being effective, and they're so isolated. We don't share, we don't know what's going on in other places. We don't grow, we don't learn from one another. And so we have small successes that we don't build upon. And I think we need to do a lot of building and extending ourselves simultaneously with doing the work. And also to respect the fact that this is going to be a process of long duration. It took hundreds of years to build these stereotypes and these ideas, and the entrenchment of prejudice and racism is there. And so none of these things are going to happen overnight. We're not going to see change overnight. It's going to be gradual. And so I think a lot of those things have to happen. We have to have commitment. We have to have dedication. We have to dig in. We have to form coalitions and cooperate and join the battles of other people. It's not just our group. It's all of us. We're in this same situation. And it's particularly important now because politically the winds are contrary to everything that you're talking about. We have this anti-woke, that's the way it's referred to in terms of understanding history and how history is shaping politics and policy today, and the pushback on sharing and understanding history. So it's even more of an uphill battle now because of these political winds, but we need to be aware of them. And this book banning and not telling the stories of how people have achieved civil rights victories. So, we have to be prepared to stay at the helm as we do this work.
Thank you so much for your feedback. To me, the conclusion. So we are kind of minority, and so definitely we got to work together. And I know the finding solution is not easy way. I can see that lots of things we have to consider, but somehow, right? And so we gotta have that connection. Each minority community then can make kind of difference, I guess. So thank you so much. And so as we draw kind of this session to a close, I want to extend my sincere gratitude to each of our distinguished speakers and attendees for engaging in this crucial conversation surrounding anti-Asian hate crimes. Today, we have traversed through kind of history, analyze present circumstances, and discuss kind of future intervention, all with the goal of understanding, dismantling the complex web of prejudice and violence against Asian community. Our discussion today underscore the importance of continuing this dialogue. it is paramount. We take the insights shared here and translate them into actionable steps, whether that is in our communities, our workplaces, or within our circles of influence. Yeah, let us challenge and hold accountable the systems and narratives that perpetuate bias and violence. Yeah, let us stand in unity with our Asian friends, colleagues, and neighbors. And let us work towards a world where diversity is celebrated and everyone can live without fear of prejudice and violence. Yeah, thank you once again for your commitment to this cause. Together we can and we will make a difference. Thank you.